Yes. Good morning, students. Once again, welcome to my lessons. Moving forward with thesis writing. Now today we are moving to lesson 5, where we are going to look at chapter 4, which is titled Presentation and Discussion of Study Findings. Presentation and discussion of study findings. So at this point, you've gone to the field, you have collected your data, now you are back to your office or wherever you are. Now, what exactly are you supposed to do with the raw data that you have collected? You have to clean it, you have to make it palatable, you have to cook it, you have to flavor it, you have to make sure that the audience intended for will really consume it and will feel, yes, you have done an academic work. So, chapter 4, always the title will be 4.0, then presentation and discussion of study findings. That's how we number chapter 4. Then 4.1, as we've seen before, is always introduction. And this introduction gives the outline, gives the structure of the whole chapter. It shows the reader what he or she expects throughout the whole chapter. And therefore, when they are reading your work, they are looking back to see if actually what you say that you are going to look at chronologically is what you are looking at. And it creates the flow of information into the mind of the audience. Apart from creating chronology, it brings about the logical kind of arrangement of ideas as they flow down. And when ideas are flowing, they create understanding. They affect affinity for understanding, the ability of the audience understanding. But when information is scattered, jumbled, lacking order, whether chronological or logical, then you confuse the reader. The reader at the end of the day fails to understand what you are communicating as far as your research report is concerned. So, like you can say this way, if you are doing the introduction, you can say, this chapter presents the findings, interpretations, and discussions according to the objectives, research questions, and or hypotheses. Importantly, the discussion should be related to the literature review, because your literature review is related to the objectives of the study. And therefore, what you are presenting here must also be related to your literature review. So we are saying, when we talk of questions and or hypotheses, this means that it's not a must you use both of them at one time. If you decide to use questions, well and good. Don't struggle with hypotheses. If you decide to move forward with hypotheses, then that's okay. Because you see, with the questions, the answer is no or yes. Yeah? I don't know. But with the hypothesis, is like, that's the responses. Would be like strongly agree, agree, disagree, strongly disagree, etc. So you have to be aware of what you are actually are doing. So I'm saying that in the introduction, the candidate, the student, the researcher should reforecast the objectives, research questions, and or hypotheses as presented in chapter 1. As presented what? In chapter 1. Don't just start writing anything which we cannot link to what we have in chapter 1. For example, you can do it this way. You can say, to analyze the extent to which the frequency of exposure to practical in science subjects enhance students' academic performance in the subject. You are doing introduction. Yes, that's how you can do it. So after introduction, we move to 4.2. In 4.2, it is subsection, which is talk about the general and demographic information. General and demographic information about respondents, because we want to understand who these respondents are. Therefore, their characteristics, their behavior, their occupation, their age, their gender, and any other character will dictate, will influence how they respond to questions asked or hypotheses put forward. That's why it is important to understand the respondent. Yes, because what they are does influence how they respond to the questions asked or hypothesis that is put forward by the researcher. So, under general and demographic information, we can look at different information. Like 4.2.1, we can look at general information to include return rate and any research problem. Now here, you are trying to tell us findings. Yes, you administered, for example, 500 questionnaires. Well, fine. How many came back out of 500? Would you want us to assume that you are able to retrieve all the 500 questionnaires? The answer is no. What about your interview schedule? I've seen most of the researchers, there is something they have been assuming, which I think they take it for granted. Yeah. You will find that the section of validity and reliability, researcher has talked about having retrieved 450 out of 500 questionnaires. Yeah. Meaning the sample size was 500. And now he has 450 retrieved questionnaires. But you will still find that in his analysis in this chapter 4, he is analyzing responses from 500 respondents. Well, the figure can be neglected. Yeah. But what is it that we are doing here? So, this general information that includes the return rate, we are saying that it should not be more than 3 pages. No, no. Then we are moving forward to look at demographic data to include types of sampling units, like if there were schools or colleges, educational level, experience, age, gender, marital status, all those. That's what we expect to see under demographic, general and demographic information. Then after you've done away with this general and demographic information, you move to 4.3, which is findings, objective research question, and or hypothesis. So here it's where now you will tell us what you found out. Objective by objective, question by question, hypothesis by hypothesis. So note, the objective question and or hypothesis should be stated in a phrase to summarize the main issues in the objective. For example, the objective stated in 4.1, for example, becomes frequency of practical exposure and students' performance, for example. So the candidate, the researcher, is expected to appropriately introduce the objective, research question, and or hypothesis. Get it clear, and or hypothesis. For example, the first task of this study was to analyze the extent to which the frequency of exposure to practical science enhances students' academic performance in that particular subject. You have to bring it that way. It comes as an objective. Students were asked to indicate the extent to which they performed practical experiments in physics. The results are indicated in this particular table or in this particular figure, because you can either use tables or you can use figures. Note that the table should be numbered by chapter, yes, and on top of the table, as indicated in the table, and the figure numbered at the bottom. You have to do that. So please note that either use a table or a figure, but not both. I've seen some researchers, some students we supervise, we find it has a table, it has a figure. No, both of them serve the same purpose. So after the table presentation, it is imperative to avoid repetitiveness of the same table. Hence, the candidate should interpret the table of contents creatively without reproducing the figures as they are. For example, the candidate could use terms like majority instead of 100%, by saying 100% respondents. No, don't do that. Or you can use few instead of just saying 0%. Half instead of saying 50%. 3/4 instead of 75%. Or nearly 2/3 instead of 64%. Because what is the sense? In the figure, in the table, we can see using our eyes the percentages. We can see the figures. Now, in this narrative, why should you repeat exactly those figures? And you put it differently in a narrative way and give the interpretation of what those figures mean. So the last step should be discussion. should be discussion of the findings using cross-reference in relation to literature reviewed. Try as much as possible to indicate the extent to which the findings find support or deviate from the literature review. Because the literature review has said something. The literature review has said something. So your findings should be supporting what it is in the literature review, and at the same time, what is in the literature review is likely to support what you have found out, or it will show how it is not supporting what you have found out. So this is where you have to bring this out clearly. Yes. So the candidate should provide a plausible explanation, the deviation, if any. Whenever there is a deviation, provide a plausible explanation why there is that deviation. Ensure that all data related to each objective are presented and discussed under the relevant objective. Let it be clear, chronological, and logical. For example, you can say 4.3 findings for objective 1. Generate a relevant subheading that reflects this objective. So when you are labeling the figure and numbering the figure, don't repeat the objective as the heading. Paraphrase, rephrase that objective to give you a good subheading for that figure or that table. Yes. Then 4.4, you can say findings for objective 2. Another creative title to reflect objective 2. You do that. I've seen some students, you find the title of the figure is a question. The title of the figure is hypothesis. No, you are supposed to paraphrase, you are supposed to rephrase it as a heading. Then findings for the last chapter, for example. Note, when presenting data, do not use both table and figures. No. Choose to use one of the two graphics and ensure that they are discussed and not left hanging without any discussion to elaborate findings. So what are we saying here? What we are saying here, as I come to conclusion, I'm saying that chapter 4 is the easiest because you describe, you give exactly what you found out. You don't create your judgment. You don't bring your own observation, but you record exactly what you found out from the field. Then as you do that, you give an interpretation what you have gotten. And when you are giving the interpretation of every presentation, because a presentation would be a figure or a table. So under the table, you interpret what is in the table, the reader. Don't assume that we know, because what is in the table or in the figure, those are numbers. But what they mean, we don't know. So we expect that you as a researcher, you give a good interpretation of what those figures mean in relation to the ground, in relation to where you did the research, and in relation to what is happening in the environment and what they mean. And when you are doing this, it is advisable that you can use the literature review, because you are supporting what you have found out by maybe saying according to Bay 2018, he said this, and that. So what I said is in tandem, is in conformity with what you have found out, what you have presented in the figure or table, and your interpretation. You find they are agreeing. When you do that, you make your chapter 4 formidable, acceptable, publishable, and one that will receive applause from scholars who happen to do some desk or secondary kind of data collection from your work. So this is how you can be able to come up with a publishable thesis. Otherwise, when you just do things that are discordant, things that are disconnected, things that are not related, there's lack of law, there's lack of academic opinion, you are giving just the interpretation, then we just realize you have not done good work. As supervisors, we shall always come back to you and make you do the right thing. And when you do the right thing, you are happy. Though, from my experience, many students, you find they feel annoyed when they are corrected, and especially if their mind is focused on a given thing. For example, if a student has already picked somebody's work, research from somewhere, and he knows he'll only be cutting and pasting, let a student suffer from what we call academic inertia. Anytime the supervisor will tell him or her that do like this, find he cannot make a simple correction. Why? Because he's not prepared to do his or her work. So these are things we go through and we experience, and therefore that's why I took it upon myself to teach and make sure that students who will follow what I'm teaching can be able to do their own work and reduce the amount of plagiarism they are likely to commit. Otherwise, thank you very much. I'm happy for you. Have a good time. Enjoy yourself. See you in the next lesson, which we shall be looking at lesson 6, and that will be conclusion and recommendations of your thesis. Thank you. Bye, and have a good time.